the year 1987, NASA launched the last of America's deep space probes. Aboard this compact starship, a lone astronaut, Captain William Buck Rogers, was to experience cosmic forces beyond all comprehension. In a freak mishap, his life support systems were frozen by temperatures beyond imagination. Ranger 3 was blown out of its planned trajectory into an orbit 1,000 times more vast, an orbit which was to return Buck Rogers to Earth 500 years later.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Remembering Science Fiction Television Shows of the 1960s and 1970s. I am your host, Roy Bjellquist, and I want to welcome my special co-host tonight who got in contact with me and had volunteered to be a part of the show with other members, fans out there, which I really appreciate, and that is Mr. Rob Barnes. Welcome, Rob. Thanks for being on the show with me.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
How's your night going? Okay?
Going fine so far. No
Awesome.
murder hornets.
Well, I want to welcome everybody out there, and thanks for joining us. First, I just want to say hi to Francine. Hi, Francine. Diane, good to see you out there. Diane, you will hopefully be a hostess with me one of these times down the road. And Deb, welcome. Deb, I'm hoping that you will too as well. Hi, Francine. And Mary Beth, I'm seeing you out there too. Thanks for joining us tonight. So we are going to be talking about Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. This was a science fiction television series that premiered in 1979 on NBC and was on for 2 seasons. And I have to admit, I was a huge Buck Rogers fan of the series. It was something that was on right after Battlestar Galactica. And essentially, it was a Glenn A. Larson production. So there were a lot of elements from that series that were similar to Battlestar Galactica in that sense, because it was that same type of production. But it was a standalone of its own based on the character from the 1930s. So Rob, I have to ask you, when it was originally on, were you a big fan?
I was. I actually, it's kind of embarrassing to say, but I saw it in the movie theater twice.
Yep.
Because they did release the pilot in the movie theater the same way they released Battlestar Galactica pilot. So yeah, I mean, I was itching for some sci-fi back then, so I went and saw it.
You know, it's interesting that you're talking about that too, Rob, because I honestly did not see the theatrical release of Buck Rogers. My friend Joe Metz, who was actually on last week and we were talking about Star Wars, he actually had the opportunity to see it and he had told me about it. And from my readings and recollections too, it premiered a lot earlier in the year. It was came out in March of 1979. And I guess NBC had actually had the rights to the series and were, or the movies as they were supposed to be. I believe it was supposed to be a plan where they were going to do like 1 or 2 movies and then possibly go to series. But then what happened was the idea of having it as a theatrical release is what came up. And they wanted to do that similar to what they did with Battlestar Galactica. And it was released and it was successful. And if, for moviegoers out there and fans of the series, if you have the opportunity to watch the movie version, the beginning credits are a lot different than they were for the series.
There's something, all right.
They almost made it kind of like a James Bondish type of setup where, Buck Rogers Gilgerard is laying on the letters, and then he's being approached by, Erin Gray's character, and then also Pamela Hemsley's character, and kind of making him like this sci-fi hero, which Buck Rogers really was. But it was a lot of fun to watch, and it's really hard to believe that series actually debuted on NBC 41 years ago.
Wow.
Seeing some comments that are starting to come through. I see Dennis is out there, and he said I was lucky enough to meet, he was talking about meeting the cast of Buck Rogers shortly after Breakaway 2019. Yeah, I remember you telling us about that, Dennis. That's really cool. And that you actually got to see them. Vince, I wanted to say hi to you. Hi, Warren. Hope you're doing well. And Dennis, thanks again for joining us as well, too. Now, the one thing I have to say about Buck Rogers, I mean, the first season when it started, and even starting with the theatrical release, the movie, it starts off that he is frozen, for essentially 500 years. He awakens in the 25th century. His ship is captured by the Draconians, who are in the process of having a peace treaty set up with the Earth. There's a lot of tension between them. However, when he's brought aboard the ship, they are not sure aboard the Draconian ship, which is the flagship of Princess Ardala and Commander Kane, who's actually her aide. And there's a lot of speculation that he's possibly a spy by the Earth Defense Directorate to try to find out information about them. And Princess Ardala seems to be very enamored with Captain Buck Rogers and tries to find out information. And they tap into his computer and they find out he was frozen, essentially in suspended animation for that period of time. They send him back to Earth. And as I was saying, the Earth has been having a lot of conflict with the Draconians, and they have a Earth defense shield that is up, which is keeping them, safe from marauders, pirates, things of that nature. And what they do is they put a tracker onto his ship to try to find out how they can penetrate that defense shield. So in essence, when they do recover, Buck thinks he's going back to Earth. He thinks he's back in present day, and he almost gets fired upon by the Earth Defense Directorate, their team. And they bring him in, and then he's essentially being, questioned, and he's feeling like a criminal. And everything is being brought to his attention of where he's at, what's happened. There's been, there was a Third World War that took place shortly after his flight, and essentially most of Earth had been decimated by, nuclear war. And anything beyond the cities that did survive is not very pleasant. There's a lot of nomad type creatures out there, beings that are kind of radioactive beings, people that, have, been unfortunate and are like scavengers. But he wants to get out there and he wants to try to find out about his family and find out what, essentially happened with him. And I think that the entire theme of the first season of Buck Rogers really dealt with that theme of him, coping in the 25th century and learning to adapt. And that there was almost a charm about it. Wouldn't you say, Rob?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was stranger in a strange land. One of the first things Buck encounters is Dr. Theopolis and Tweaky.
Yeah.
Which, is classic. And, he's a total fish out of water. But on the other hand, they are kind of too. They don't understand him.
Right.
And I thought that was it led to a lot of humor in the first season. And that definitely it vanished in the second season.
Yeah, and with the first season, especially in the opening episodes and even in the earlier episodes, he was trying to become accustomed. And you have to take that character, you have to think about it. If you're used to everything that you have, your family, your friends, everything that you've known, and you're going on a mission. Now, this specific mission is, to the stars, and, he's doing something in space, and it's routine, and he's going to be coming back. And when he does come back, everything is gone. Everything has changed. And I really think that Gil Gerard brought a realism to that character. I think that you felt his portrayal. I think that, Wilma Deering and also Dr. Theopolis, which was the robot, and you had Tweaky, and then you had Dr. Hewer. Dr. Hewer and Wilma really brought the humanity to the table. Wilma was almost a harder type character because she was a soldier, and she really was on guard, and she was somebody that really wasn't very trusting because she knew what the Earth had been through, as did Dr. Hewer, but he was more of a scientist than a soldier. So I think he was more open to Buck's situation. And I think as the writing developed in the series, their characters were more and more flushed out. but it was the humanity, those elements that really made the character very something that we could relate to, especially since we, at the time, I mean, now we're in the 21st century, but at the time, we were in that era. I mean, the show was taking place, or, his launch was in 1987, which was 8 years in the future from when the show premiered. But essentially, he was one of us, and he was one of us that was literally being catapulted into the future, and he was experiencing things that we would have experienced, and you try to relate how we would have felt being in that type of specific situation. And I felt that, in my opinion, that, especially in the beginning, the earlier episodes, they really tried to deal with that. I have to ask you, Rob, as far as the characters, I mean, who were your favorite characters on the show?
I mean, I always liked, Buck, obviously.
Right.
I always liked Dr. Hewer. I wish they had given him a little bit more to do.
Yeah.
Colonel Deering, I mean, who can't, Aaron Gray walking around in spandex.
Yeah, she was very pretty.
No, but she was an interesting character, and I think they started to develop her throughout, better throughout the first season.
Right.
And then again, she was in the second season, she was just relegated to nothing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. I mean, I thought all the characters had potential. Definitely.
Right.
I mean, Gil Gerard, I think, especially in the pilot, he was very good. I mean, he seemed totally out of place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there was more depth in the pilot because, he went out searching for his parents, headstones, and he saw what the outside was really like. And he seemed like he was a deer in the headlights for a while in that first movie, was shell-shocked. And I wish they had done a little bit more of that in the series, like you were saying, in the first few episodes they did. But I think, they could have done more with that. But It was definitely interesting. They used got a lot of humor out of that, like I was saying too.
No, and I definitely agree with you with that. I just want to give a couple more shout outs too before we go on. I want to say hi to Martin. Martin, how are you doing tonight? Also, Nancy, thank you for joining us. Hope you're doing well. Martin's referencing that Mark Leonard was in the second season. And yes, you are right. And as we haven't said it yet, all roads do lead back to Star Trek, a phrase that I must say I coined for Mary Beth, but it is very true. All roads definitely lead back to Star Trek. And if you're looking at your timer, it took me about 14 minutes to bring up Trek into our show tonight. Yeah, Warren's saying that the pilot was very good, but soon after dissolved into satire. I can see where you're saying that, Warren. I think that a lot of the episodes, especially in the beginning, I mean, there was that touch of humor. One thing that I really enjoyed was in each episode, especially in the first season, this was very apparent, where he would do different types of references to his, to the 25th century. And he always talked about Dr. Loomis at the archives, because he would, if he would get maybe a plant or something to touch up, he spray painted part of his quarters, which was it was a little hokey, but he was trying to make it a little fresh. He was trying to bring some humanity to it, because the places there were very sterile looking. It almost seemed like it was, you were on a, like in a base or, a spaceship. It was very sterile and no matter where you would walk, it's like you had the white lights that were leading the path, and it was just very, very similar in that sense. But it was part of the, the trend of the show. And interesting enough, though, there were a lot of guest stars that were on the show that went on to appear on a lot of different things. In fact, I remember the episode, which was Planet of the Slave Girls. You had anybody out there remember the television series Rhoda out there? And you had Rhoda's husband that was on that show. Do you remember that? Just bringing that up. A lot of actors. And then also from science fiction, for science fiction fans, from Voyage to Bomb the Sea, you had Robert Dowell, who I had not seen in anything since Voyage to Bomb the Sea, and he played the character Chip Morton, and he was also one of the supporting characters. John, welcome. He's also indicating about Roddy Mcdowall from Planet of the Apes. Yeah, I mean, Roddy Mcdowall was on there. So it was kind of cool that you had a lot of reoccurring actors that were known from, previous shows that were a part of this type of franchise.
A lot of Batman villains in that show too. There was Cesar Romero and Frank Gorshin.
Yes.
And Julie Newmar. I mean, they almost had all the main Batman villains in there.
No, you know what? You're absolutely right. You know what, Rob? I actually never stopped to think about that, and that's so true. And Frank Gorshin, I mean, he did a 2-part episode, which was called "The Plot to Kill a City," and his character was, he was villainous, but he was also very, very good in that. In fact, there was an actor who just recently passed. His name is Anthony James.
Yes.
And he was the actor that was in that show who wore the mask, and he was scarred due to radiation. And what Frank Gorshin's character was plotting to do was to essentially destroy New Chicago through means of radioactivity. And what happened was Anthony James's character assisted Buck because he didn't want what happened to his planet to happen to Earth. And Anthony James was an actor who did a lot of movies. He usually was cast as a heavy. One movie I remember him from was Burnt Offerings, if anybody remembers that, from 1976, and that was with
the chauffeur.
Yes, he was the chauffeur. Yes, with Karen Black.
Yes.
Yep. Michelle, I want to say hi. Good to see you out there. And Diane just indicated too, Frank Gorshin was awesome in anything he did. Yes, yeah, he was. And then Diane was saying about Buster Crabbe was the original Buck Rogers. And that's something too, Diane is absolutely right. With that, there was the episode called Return of the Fighting 69th. And they had characters that were older characters. In fact, Peter Graves was in that episode, and who was known from Mission Impossible. But going back to Buster Crabbe, in Planet of the Slave Girls, there was a virus that came through and essentially took out the warriors, or took out the starfighter pilots. So what they did was they got old recruits, and Buster Crabbe's character was one of them. And it was really cool because you had, his name, in fact, his character's name was Gordon, and he was relating with Buck, through the communications. And he even, Buck Rogers says to Gordon, he goes, "How did you learn how to fight like that?" And he goes, "Oh, I've been doing that since way before you've been born." And then, Buck goes, "You really think so?" And then he goes, "Young man, I know so." So it was kind of cool because, here he was the original Buck Rogers. He was also the original Flash Gordon from the 1930s. And he's interacting with, Buck Rogers of 1979. So it was kind of like a little inner humor there, which I thought was really cool. Rob, did you have an episode that really stood out in your mind that was like a favorite of yours?
Well, definitely the pilot. The pilot is my favorite overall.
Okay.
But for some reason, Space Vampire has always been a favorite of mine. It is incredibly cheesy, but for some reason, it's just, I find it one of the, most enjoyable episodes.
You know what, though? I'll be honest with you. I really enjoyed that, too. And the Space Vampire was called, what was it, the Vorton, I think? Or the
Vorvon.
Vorvon. It was the Vorvon. And it was really this creepy looking character. I mean, and he just looked like pure evil. And he actually reminded me of something. And Rob, you and I were just talking about this movie, Salem's Lot. He actually reminded me like something out of Salem's Lot. Do you folks remember anything Salem's Lot out there? But that's who that really reminded me of.
Yeah, similarly.
And Mary Beth is saying, loving the Dune poster, Rob. Very cool.
I've had that since about 1984 when the movie came out.
How can Dune be not, a 36-year-old movie? That's not even right. But yeah, going back to the one with the Vorvon. In fact, Chris Stone, who was married to Dee Wallace Stone, was the commander of the space station in that episode. And it was kind of creepy. And it was suspenseful, and they had the eerie music going on, and you didn't know what was going to happen. And, you had the humor between Buck and Tweaky, which was always kind of cool. And there was like a little droid he was trying to get information from to find out exactly, what happened on there. And then they had the 20th century equivalent of a cross that was like a power locket. So it's like if it touched the Vorvon, it would drain it of its energy. And then unfortunately, the Vorvon wanted to take over Wilma. And, and then he comes over to her and he's got his like 2 fingers out instead of using his like, vampire teeth. He's like, giving her the fingers with his like in the neck. And then she's like,
That the little amulet they used was actually Adama's from Battlestar Galactica.
Great trivia.
Yes.
Awesome trivia. Yes. Nothing like recycling the props, right?
That was Glenn Larson for you. Yep.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because Battlestar Galactica, production went from 1978 into 1979, and Buck Rogers actually, production had started on that, at least with the pilot in late, 1978. Mm-hmm. So the two were kind of overlapping, but they were totally separate from each other, which, because they wanted them to be similar but different, because you could always, you could see some of the controls of the ship were similar, as far as the joysticks and what have you, and then even the designs of the ship.
Yeah, they changed the joystick later on. When they first started out, it was the actual Viper joystick.
Yes.
And later on, it just totally was different. It's like, oh, we better get rid of this.
But as the series continued in the first season, I mean, a lot of the earlier episodes seemed to really involve Buck with Wilma. And it almost seemed like they were trying to establish a relationship where maybe the two of them, would possibly be together. But unfortunately, it seemed that they decided to go into a different direction with the writing, because it was almost like they wanted him to be able to have his romances with other characters, kind of, I hate to use this example, but it's apparent. I mean, with Captain Kirk with, Yeoman Rand. I mean, it was almost like it would be limiting him to have other, opportunities with, other female characters. So it was something they kind of strayed away from, although I think it would have been really nice if the two of them, had furthered their relationship. But unfortunately, it's almost, what tends to happen in a show when they do that, then it changes the whole dynamics. But it was kind of hinted at, and it seemed like in certain episodes it was going to go in that direction, especially in the second season, which we'll talk a little about in a little while. But I think with those first season episodes, she had more of a part. Buck was more, he was more a aide. He was somebody that was misplaced. He was somebody that was being indoctrinated into their community. And he was somebody that helped the directorate and was a part of the team, but wasn't officially a part of the team. And I think it was good when they kept it on that level. And that's something the first season really, really did, which I thought was really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. And it's just as time kind of evolved, they tended to get away from that. Some of the comments that are, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rob.
I'm just going to say, I think they kind of wanted to keep the Ardala, Buck Rogers relationship open too. So maybe that's why they didn't, fully go with a Buck Wilma relationship, because they wanted to maybe keep it open for the future.
No, I definitely would agree with that. Some of the comments that are coming through, Martin is saying the aspect of Wilma and Buck echoes back to the original movie shoots of the 1930s. Yes, and you're absolutely right, Martin, because Wilma was an original character from the 30s. I mean, Rob and I were talking about this prior to the show, when we were broadcasting, but Buck Rogers of the 1930s with the comic strip and everything, and that aspect of it was a lot different than what eventually evolved for the series that's in 1979. But that is very true. Dennis is indicating Gil was not happy with second season. He wanted it to go in a different direction, but like Space 1999, some of the directors had different ideas. Yeah, and it's unfortunate because a lot of times if it's not broken, don't fix it. I mean, from a Space 1999 aspect, I would, strongly agree with you on that, Dennis. And Andrew, good to see you out there, Andrew. Same sound effects as Galactica 2. Yes, that's a very good point, Andrew. There were a lot of those similar sound effects that were being utilized through the show. Just want to say hi to Deborah. Hey, Deborah, thanks for joining us. Yeah, my evil laugh. But also, what was kind of cool in the first season, they actually had a character that was portrayed by Gary Coleman, who was this genius, and they brought him in, and he actually was revived from suspended animation, and he was this brain who was going to help this civilization to actually get back on track. And then they wound up kidnapping him, and one of the people that kidnapped him, the leaders of another group, had turned out to be my favorite Martian,
Ray Walston.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he actually was in an episode, which was kind of cool.
Yeah,
Hieronymus Fox.
Yes. The president.
President.
Yeah.
And Wilma actually wound up saving him, which was kind of cool. And then, Buck, intervened, and then the rest was history. David Balter. Dave, thanks for joining us. Gil went with that Jen from Gunsmoke as a producer and as a second-year producer. Leslie Stevens was actually a producer on this series, and Leslie Stevens was known from back in his days from actually doing The Outer Limits. So I thought that was kind of cool, that the history of that show kind of, came through with that, which was pretty neat to, do. And yes, Dennis, you're right. There was a New Year's Eve episode. It was a riddle episode where the directorate thought the Earth was being attacked, and all these riddles were being sent to Buck and to the directorate that was garnered towards him, to Buck Rogers. And it turned out it was Hieronymus Fox just trying to, do like a surprise party or what have you. But it was a way of bringing him back. And it was almost a way of doing a flashback episode. It seemed like shows in the 70s, even in the 80s, had their one episode that they would utilize in order to do like flashback scenes, because it was a way of actually keeping the budget down and, utilizing previous material. Yeah. Star Trek did that with the Cage, and also Buck Rogers, obviously with this episode. And then Star Trek The Next Generation actually went on to do that in one of its episodes when Riker was inflicted with when he was on the planet and he got hit by the thorn.
Yeah.
And they were trying to, get the poison out of him. And they were thinking that, with pleasant emotions would, make him feel better. Yes. Shades of Grey. Thank you, Warren. And Dennis is saying that was a blast for Buck. Exactly. So it's interesting how different shows, of those times, each decade, 60s, 70s, and 80s, utilize that type of philosophy. It was kind of cool.
They called them it a bottle episode, I believe.
Yes. No, that's so true.
Yep, saving money using old footage.
And the other thing, too, is they really didn't get out of the studio that often either. I mean, everything was pretty much internalized. But going back to your point, too, and Mike, hey, Mike, good to see you out there. Said Buster Crabbe was in an episode of the original Buck Rogers. Yes, we did mention that, but thanks, Mike. And he was actually in Planet of the Slave Girls, which was kind of cool.
What a name.
What was that, Rob?
What a name. They had some great episode names on that.
I know, they had Vegas in Space. They had, Planet of the Amazon Women. Escape from Wedded Bliss. One of the episodes, too, that was in the first season that I felt was kind of sad, and it was an episode where they actually got to venture outside of the studio, was when he's looking for his old girlfriend. It was called The Dream of Jennifer. And they had actually gotten Anne Lockhart for the part. And what happened was he is actually at a terminal, a spaceport, and he sees somebody that really, reminds him of his old flame, his old love before he, left on his mission. And she looks just like her. And what happens is eventually he's able to meet up with her, and he just wants to get to know her because he's really tapping into the, his emotions of, meeting up with her. But it turns out that it's a ploy that these aliens essentially gave her surgery, a form of plastic surgery, to alter her appearance. They stole the photograph from his quarters, and they're going to use him as a bargaining chip. And it's very sad. And in fact, at the very end of the episode, she winds up, sacrificing herself, and she actually gets killed. And then, Buck pretty much goes crazy and takes them out. But you had to feel his grief, because here's a person that was essentially taken away from his family, taken away from his friends, taken away from everything that he knew. He was starting to become a part of the community. He was starting to try to, merge with an acceptance of being 500 years into the future. And then, like all of us, we all have our moments, in life where, we reflect on different things, we get nostalgic, and, have a yearning to go, maybe back to that place, where we grew up, or, when we were children, or, when we were younger. And it just, was really resonating with him, because here, all of that was left behind. For some of us, when we think back to our past, it could be, 10, 20, 30 years ago. For him, it was 500 years ago. And he was almost in this type of a slump. And it was something that, Dr. Hewer and Wilma Deering were actually picking up on. And he just was like, I'm dealing with it. And that's when he, met up with her. So I thought it was an interesting story. I thought it was a necessary story. And I also thought it was a very sad story, because it dealt with his emotions, but there was a lot of realism with it. And I tend to be a nostalgic person anyway, so I kind of tapped into that. But it was a very, very sad episode.
Yeah, I would agree. That was a good episode, and it was nice to see a more of Buck's character in that one. It was definitely, add a little more psychological depth to them all. Needed a few more of those.
Yeah, exactly. And it really helped with the character. Oh, Mike's commenting, no, Mike, I did not mention about Captain Pike. There was an episode of Buck Rogers in the background. You can hear them saying over the loudspeaker, Captain Christopher Pike, will you please come to, to the main gate? Captain Christopher Pike, come to the main gate. So it was a reference to classic Star Trek, which was actually in the episode, which was really cool. So yeah, thanks for bringing up that, Mike. Also, David Bolter saying, was great seeing David Groh. Yes, David Groh, who played Joe on Rhoda, and that was he was part of Wilma's past. And that was the episode we were talking about a little earlier, Planet of the Slave Girls. What was interesting about that specific character and scene was that Buck is part of a training run, and he's helping the cadets, and he really wasn't approving of David Groh's character, the way he was teaching his cadets. And what happens is they meet face to face, and Wilma kind of gets in the middle of the two of them, and you could see that Wilma actually had a relationship with David Groh's character and previously. And then what happens is she asks Buck to help train the cadets. So what happens is they're doing the scene where, Buck is trying to explain about how you do things in formation status, and then he kind of refers to football as far as what you have to do. And he says that he wants to borrow David Groh's character for assistance in doing the quarterback blitz. Yes, thanks, Martin. And what happens is they start tackling each other, and they pretty much devastate, destroy the training room. But it was kind of a fun moment. But what is kind of cool is, as things progress through the episode and they wind up crashing on the planet, they actually have a mutual respect for each other, and they have trust that forms. So it was a kind of cool moment.
I thought they had a good chemistry together. I mean, I wish they had brought his character back a little bit more.
Yeah, that would have really worked out well, because I mean that's something that like you said about the chemistry, when two actors are able to have the exchange like that, it really can make the show that much more better.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Sue, just want to say hi. She's saying, great reference. I didn't remember that they announced Captain Christopher Pike over the PA system. Proves that all roads do lead to Star Trek. They certainly do, Sue. That is so true. Thanks again to Mike for bringing that up. David's saying, such a huge loss losing Tim O'Connor as Dr. Hewer in the second year changes such a great talent. Yeah, I totally agree with you, David, about that. It was definitely a loss to the series. And you have to wonder what sometimes, studio execs or the suits or writers are thinking. A lot of times ratings may be involved with that, but to me, those were the type of things that really made the series work. And I really felt that, Buck and Dr. Hewer and Wilma Deering really had a great chemistry. And even Theo was lost in the second season. I mean, you had Tweaky, but you didn't have Theo. And Theo was kind of the balance with Tweaky because he was the interpreter.
Yeah, Tweaky
yeah.
and Theo had a nice Laurel and Hardy, type thing going on almost.
Yeah, and it's a shame that was lost because that was very enjoyable. Some of the episodes that, just to finish out the first season, and we're talking about some of the things that took place, how they try to have references to, the original, to the 20th century. They had actually an episode that dealt with the Olympics, and where different teams were trying to pull out because they didn't want to, they were being controlled, and they wanted to be able to have their freedom. So I mean, I think there was kind of a hint of things that have gone on in the past, within our generation. So there was an outline of that. They also had a beauty contest that was taking place, Miss Galaxy. And here's a trivia question: does anybody know out there who played Miss Galaxy on Buck Rogers in the 25th century? Well, that'll be one of our trivia questions for tonight. Unfortunately, she's an actress that is no longer with us, but I'm just curious to see if who remembers that. Chris,
I know.
What was that, Rob?
That I won't answer. I know that one.
I could give a hint. She was in a movie that I believe premiered in 1980, and I think the name of that movie, yes, David Balter's got it with even me giving out the name of the movie, Dorothy Stratton. Yes, that was her. In fact, the ship that was in that movie, or excuse me, that episode, was used as the Searcher, I believe. Deb, hi Deb, thanks for joining us. And yes, Deb is saying Dorothy Stratton as well too. Very good. And Michelle is jumping on that bandwagon, as well as John Haig. Mike is indicating Felix Silla complained Crichton got more attention on set than he did. It would break down and speed time fixing. Meanwhile, poor Felix was sweating in the suit. Yeah, you really had to feel bad for Felix in regards to that, because those outfits were, I mean, that was tight fitting and under the studio lights. I mean, that was really, it's hot just being in a studio type of setting. Never mind that you're wearing, something that is totally encasing you. So yeah, not fun at all.
Another little connection with Star Trek right there too. Felix Silla.
Yes. Who knows what episode of classic Star Trek he was in? And I know we'll have somebody get that within the next 10 seconds.
Actually, they're doing some research on this. It's like there are so many Star Trek actors that were in Buck Rogers. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yep. The ones that come to mind immediately for me, you have Keith Andes, who was in The Apple. I believe Rhodes Reason, who was in Bread and Circuses, was also in an episode. Harry Towns from Return of the Archons. The list definitely goes on.
Yeah, you have Anon Seven from Taste of Armageddon. I forget the actor's name, but he was in there.
Yes. Oh, David Apostrophe. I can never pronounce his last name. Yes.
But yeah, the list is like a mile long. I was very surprised. One thing I found, one little bit of trivia I found out was Glenn Larson wanted Kurt Russell to play Buck Rogers. I did not know that.
It's funny. I did not know that either until just, until recently, like you were doing the research on that. Yeah. And Kurt Russell was just getting into the movies, and he essentially did not want to be saddled with the television series, but they did want to have a younger actor to play Buck Rogers. They did not want to have somebody that was in their 30s, but Gil Gerard had done such a great job with his audition that they decided to go with him. And the rest was history.
Yeah.
Nancy's saying, I like Talk too, but after the time of the Hawk, they didn't know what to do with him. Tom Christopher made the character work. Yeah, I mean, Tom Christopher was definitely a very good actor in the series. And also, as Rob was saying about Star Trek actors, his wife in that episode was none other than the captain's woman, Barbara Luna, from Mirror Mirror. So yeah, there's another example of having somebody from classic Star Trek in that. Deb Jacoby is saying, Tom Christopher and Barbara Luna were reunited on One Life to Live in the Future. He played Carlo Hesser on that show and was one of the best villains. Oh, that's really cool, Deb. Thanks for sharing that information. Appreciate that.
Yeah, he was the one addition to the second season I liked. Hawk was a very good character.
He really, really was. And right before we get started with talking about the second season, it was interesting because the first season started winding down with Buck, or when Buck was called Flight of the War Witch, and it was a 2-part episode, and that had Julie Newmar in the show. And as you were saying, Rob, somebody that was actually in the classic Batman series from the 1960s, and then also too, you had Sid Haig. And Sid Haig had actually done a classic Star Trek episode. He was in Return of the Archons. He was one of the lawgivers that had the cloak on, and you couldn't see him. And he had the hollow tube, and doing that where they.
I never knew that. Wow.
Yeah, he was in that episode, and interesting enough, that was shot in 1979. Julie Newmar and Sid Haig had actually done a Jason, a Star Command episode together. Which was kind of cool. So the two of them were kind of being reunited as far as being evil, villainous characters. The only difference was that Sid Haig didn't have his Dragos helmet on, but essentially Julie Newmar's character, who was playing the War Witch, she was kind of a witch in the character that she was playing on Jason, the Star Command.
I actually watched that not that long ago, and she pretty much plays the same character in that.
She really does. It's so true. But it was interesting because that was the final episode of final 2 episodes of the season. And right before, essentially with that episode, it's almost, I'll say kind of a calling card is coming from a different universe, and it lands outside of New Chicago, and they're trying to find out information about it. And the Draconians find out about it as well, and they're trying to find out what it all means and everything. And what happens is they go through this vortex, and they used a lot of different types of special effects for it. It was a lot of enhanced effects for that. And from a character standpoint, before Buck leaves, he has like a tender moment with Wilma that she's very worried about him leaving, and you could see that their relationship is kind of like on the cusp of, it's almost to the next level, but it's not quite there. And it was just a moment that was kind of being defined by them, but, where she's worried. And then what happens is they all wind up going, and, it kind of finishes out the season, and everything is, fine from that standpoint. But then with the second season, which was going to be from 1980 to 1981, when they come back, it's different. The opening episode is they're on the Searcher, and the Searcher was the ship that was used in a episode from the first season, which was like a resort in space. And now you have, Asimov, who is, Admiral Asimov, who's the captain of the ship. You have a layout of the ship that unfortunately is set up and is very similar to the bridge of the Enterprise, only it's in a different type of configuration. But essentially, that's what it reminds you of. And I would think that all the Trek fans out there would agree with me with that. Wouldn't you say, Rob?
I would say so, except done on such a low budget.
Yes.
I mean, that the bridge of the Searcher was made up of leftover set pieces from the first season, and they used, a couple computer banks in the back, which you can actually see in Star Trek II. And they even used, there's a light that's been used in 100 science fiction movies that just blinks back and forth for no reason. William Shatner actually makes fun of it in Airplane 2, but they used all of these recycled pieces, and to me that is one of the most god-awful sets I have ever seen in my life.
Yeah, it was really, really bad. It really was. It was cheesy, and there's no way around it. And like you said about Universal, I mean, it's almost like the leftovers were put there, and it's to be utilized, and it was just part of their budget.
Yeah.
And also, you know, all roads lead back to Star Trek, and we're talking about actors from classic Star Trek. You had Paul Carr, who was in the pilot, the second season pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, playing Kelso in that. 15 years later, he's playing a helmsman on this, the Searcher of Buck Rogers, and it was kind of painful for me to see him in that role,
and
just because of that.
Yeah, and what the hell did they do to Tweaky?
Well, and that's just it. There, Tweaky his voice was Mel Blanc was replaced, and they had brought in another background actor, a voice actor, to do it, and that went on for, I believe, about 4 or 5 episodes, and then all of a sudden, the Tweaky that we knew and loved from the first season of Buck Rogers was back. And supposedly that occurred because of the fan mail. The fans were going crazy. I mean, I was one of them. I didn't write, but it was like, what the heck?
I mean, they didn't even try to get someone who sounded similar. I mean, it was awful.
Yeah.
It was like this high-pitched helium squeaky voice. Terrible.
Yeah, it really, really was. I want to ask our listeners or viewers out there, what were some of your favorite Buck Roger moments, or what were some of your favorite Buck Roger episodes that really stood out in your mind that you really, really enjoyed? It could be first season or second season. We'll talk a little bit more about the second season. We just started talking about that. Sue is saying Paul Carr was also on Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. Yes, he was. He actually had a recurring character that was a seaman, and then what happened was he became an officer. But when he became that officer, he actually had a breakdown and he lost it, and he wound up being thrown into the brig. And he was a recurring character, though. Clark, yes. Yes.
And then he vanished, and he came back in the second season as a different character, and I believe he got eaten by a dinosaur or something like that.
He's lucky he came back as a different character.
Yeah.
Mike's saying space vampire. So yeah, that's what Rob was saying too, Mike. Yep. Hey, Jeff Rubel's joining us. When they used original Lost in Space music on the show, seriously? That I did not know about, Jeff. Interesting. Michelle is saying Time of the Hawk, the first episode of the second season. That was not a bad episode. I mean, it was establishing the character of Hawk, and you really had to feel, I mean, his race was essentially annihilated, and that's why he pretty much went and did what he did, and he was out on a vengeance. And when Corey, when his Hawk ship inadvertently went after Buck's ship, and then the clamps went into the Starfighter and impaled her. I mean, your heart went out for her. And I thought Barbara Luna really did a great job with that character. I thought you really felt, the relationship between her and Hawk. And it was sad that she was not a recurring character, because I think it really would have worked well. But they did not want her, I guess, did not want Hawk to be tied down in that type of, situation throughout the series, or maybe she wasn't available to do, all the episodes, although she did come back as almost as a spirit in a later episode.
Yeah, Time of the Hawk was very well done.
Yeah.
And it's too bad it went downhill after that.
Yeah, exactly. And really you had that episode strengthened the relationship. I mean, there was a mutual respect between Hawk and Buck, and they both respected each other. And even in that toward at the end of that episode, it was like the battle to the death. They both, they made it even. They both knocked each other out, and they basically both fell. Or that being that came in, who was David, and again I can't pronounce his last name, but the one that was from the Star Trek episode Return of Taste of Armageddon.
Okay. He
was the one that intervened in that episode, and prevented them from killing each other. And Buck essentially, at the end, when Hawk was on trial, he stood up for him, and he said that, what, I don't blame that, what he did. I mean, his race was killed, and he lost his mate, and and then the rest was kind of history from there.
Yeah. One thing I really hate what they did with the second season. Well, a lot of things, but Wilma's character, they really diminished. She seemed more like a space stewardess
Yes.
than anything. I mean, they gave her this ridiculous, flight attendant outfit to wear around, and I just don't understand it. It's like she lost a lot of her strength from the first season.
I would totally agree with you, Rob. It was almost like Buck. I mean, there was definitely a respect where Buck was given authority, being an authoritative type of figure, and he was almost given higher privilege. But it was almost like he was over Wilma in that sense. And not only that, but they took away from her character, and it was, and then she was. I mean, Erin Gray is beautiful, but it was almost like they were just showing her off as with her, as like a model, as opposed to as utilizing her strength as a character. And it was almost like she really didn't have a say as she did in the first season. And it was a tragedy to the character. And it was something that really was a shame that had happened. Michelle just commented, she said, Barbara Luna told me that she was supposed to be a regular, but she was under contract. So that explains what happened with that. Dennis is saying the Crystals. The Crystals was the episode that Amanda Weiss was in. And that was the one where they find her and she has no memory. And there's a being that's kind of all wrapped up. And she's worried she's going to evolve in that. Amanda Weiss was an actress that Vince and I actually saw at a Chiller convention. And if I remember correctly, I think she was in the movie Better Off Dead, if anybody remembers that movie.
I think she was in that. She was in the first Nightmare on Elm Street.
Okay. And that was a 1984 movie, if I remember correctly. Better Off Dead, I think, was 85, so it was right in the genre of those films. Better Off Dead was one of those movies that I think when I saw that, I saw that down in Florida with a friend of mine. I was visiting my friend Ed Dicker at the time, and we watched that and with a group of people, and I had never saw that movie, and I laughed so hard. It was just so hysterical.
I still quote the paper boy in that movie,
$2.
$2.
Oh my God, that was hysterical. Kind of going off track there, but yeah, just had to share that. Dennis is saying my favorite is Testimony of a Traitor. Yes, and Dennis, I would have to agree with you. That was really an excellent episode, and I think that episode for the second season came about as close to the first season as possible. And even with that, unfortunately, it was lacking a lot of what was a part of the first season, but it dealt with what had happened, with Buck, and evidence that essentially was making him look that he had sold out the United States and was responsible for the Third World War that occurred, and then why there was nuclear devastation. And his best friend had left a message, and a recorded message. It's essentially saying that he was a traitor. One of my biggest beefs, and it's not done as much today as it was done in the 60s and the 70s, and a lot of shows are guilty of it, Space 1999 included, and as well as Star Trek and other shows, where somebody is in Lost in Space. You have memories of that are being tapped into, of things that occurred from one's past, and they show it up on a view screen. And as they're showing it, you're actually seeing yourself, as part of the memory. And obviously that's, from a cinematic standpoint, that's the way they're going to do it, because it makes the scenery more interesting. But, if a person has a memory, they're not going to see themselves. And unfortunately, it's just something that a lot of shows do and did. And Buck Rogers is no exception.
I thought that would have been a good opportunity to bring back Dr. Hewer for that one episode.
Yeah, that really would have been.
I mean, that would have been great.
And also the, Theo, and then also the council that were essentially, they were the robots, the quads, the ampuquads, because it was brought out in the first season that they were actually put into that position because of their objectivity. And I mean, then there's also, the people that would say, the machines are leading, but it was the basis of what they started with. And again, it's like altering, the facts, breaking the rules, and something that, the first season and the second season did. John Haig, yes, He's saying second season, the Bringers of Wonder ripoff episode, Mark of the Saurian. John, when I saw that episode, when I first saw it, I was like, oh my gods. I agree. Space 1999 ripoff, unfortunately. And it was an early episode of the second season of Buck Rogers. And what happens is Buck has a fever. He's not doing well. And he's looking at a view screen and he sees these aliens that essentially have a haze around them, and then you also see them as reptiles, and nobody believes him. And it was, definitely of a I think they definitely got their influence from the Bringers of Wonder. No questions asked, where Martin Landau sees the aliens because he's hooked up to a machine, whereas Buck Rogers is from the 25th century, or from the 20th century, and his physiology is different than that of the people of the 25th century.
And then they fixed it by using their little watch device, which was from Galactica 1980.
Ooh. That itself is painful.
I'm sorry.
When I think of Galactica 1980, I try not to think about it.
Next week, Galactica 1980.
Yeah, I doubt that Mike and Mary Beth are going to want to cover that. And that's a good lead in, folks. Wednesdays, Sci-Fi Distilled, 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Mike and Mary Beth do television shows and movies of the 1980s and 1990s and beyond. They are going to be doing Stargate SG-1 on with Bruce Playfair, who was actually on here a few weeks ago when we did the Star Lost. So definitely watch out for that. It's going to be pretty cool. So just wanted to give that, but I would not wish Galactica 1980 on them at all. Yeah, Mike's even saying we don't speak of Galactica 1980. The only thing good about that was when Starbuck was on. It was called The Return of Starbuck, and even that was painful because they had the Cylon that had Gary Owens' voice.
Oh God!
From the Sakatumi days, from Rowan and Martin's Laughing. But painful. But anyway, on to better roads. Yeah, it unfortunately, Buck Rogers for the second season, there were only about 12 episodes that went through, and the ratings declined, and that's essentially what took it out. And I think if they had stuck with the original formula, the series definitely probably would have been more successful. And it's a shame that but it's 40 years and it's a thing of the past.
Yeah, I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that Gil Gerard wanted more serious content for the show. So he was pushing for changes to be made.
Right.
So I don't know if he was one of the reasons they went with a different direction in the second season. Although I've now read that he hates the second season. So
yeah, and that's what I heard too. And that essentially he wanted something more serious, but unfortunately they just went in a totally different direction of seriousness, unfortunately. But it's kind of scary, it's that old saying, careful what you ask for, you just might get it. And if that is the case, that's kind of like what happened with here. Oh, Michelle's writing, I am friends with Tom Christopher on Facebook. I met him at WinterCon. I was in line to get a photo with him, and when the curtain opened and he saw me, he said, a familiar face. It freaked me out that he recognized me. He came over and gave me the biggest bear hug, and what I was thinking was, I'm being hugged by a hawk. That is a super cool story, Michelle. And you know what? When you hear stories like that, it really is humbling, and it really means a lot. I can relate to that, a similar story with Suzanne Heimer Peterson, who from Space 1999 fame, essentially was Barbara Bain's stand-in for both year 1 and year 2 of Space 1999. And she had joined Facebook about a year before the Alpha 2014 convention that was in Peterborough in the UK. And what had happened was I had become friends with her, and then my dad had a stroke in November of that year. And then the following year in September, when I went to the convention, I went up to her to get an autograph, just a signing, just to say hello. And she looked at me and she goes, I know you, we're friends on Facebook. And she said, how's your dad doing? Is he doing okay? And I had talked about that with Suzanne just recently, and it's really so endearing when somebody remembers you, and especially the fact that Tom Christopher did remember you from that. I mean, that says a lot about him. And I mean, you know, thank you for sharing that. That is really awesome, because stories like that you really don't hear very often. And it shows you what a warm person that he is. And that's really cool. So thank you, Tom. And, you know, thank you, Michelle, for sharing, and, you know, kudos to Tom Christopher for that. That's awesome. Jeff Rubel is saying, he's bringing up about last comment about Galactica 1980, and apparently Starbucks starved to death on that planet. And I promise, folks, we will not talk about Galactica 1980 anymore. But anyway, I wanted to bring up, just, you know, we're getting close to the hour. I've been trying to keep us not going over too far, because I've done that in the past. Just some trivia things that have been brought up, and things that we kind of talked about. We were talking about Ardala and Kane. Interesting that Kane in the movie version was Henry Silva, and then for the TV series, it was none other than, anybody know?
Michael Ansara.
You got it. So it was kind of cool. Thanks for sharing that, Rob. Michael and Sarah, who became Kane, and it was almost like the relationship and the dynamics of those two characters had changed, where there was a hint of Ardala and Kane perhaps being something of a, I don't want to say a romance, but something that there was something going on. But then with Michael Ansara's Kane and Ardala, it was more of a business type of arrangement. You know, it was just, you know, he was there to get things done, make sure they got done. And, you know, she was the princess and he was along for the ride, but he wanted to, you know, succeed in the sense of being with her, because it would bring him power. So I just thought that was interesting to share as well too. Also, another tidbit, the series used footage of the British and French pavilions at the Expo in 1967 in Canada to represent those futuristic buildings that Dr. Heward's office tower and Buck's apartment building actually was. So interesting that was something that was from Canada. I know we have Canadian fans out there, and just wanted to bring that up. Dennis, Warren, I don't know if you were aware of that. I thought that was kind of interesting to find out about. So that was kind of cool too. But yeah, Buck Rogers. I mean, hopefully, if you haven't watched it recently, you'll definitely want to check it out. It's definitely a fun show, and something that was, you know, I really thought was cool about, you know, talking about. Do you have any closing thoughts about the series, Rob?
No, I would just recommend, you know, if you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's a fun show. Don't expect to be, you know, overwhelmed by it. It's pure 70s entertainment.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So true.
One thing I would say to look for is Buck's stunt double. There's a number of shots in early episodes where, you know, 6'1" big bulky Gil Gerard suddenly turns into this like 5'8" guy who can jump all over the place. It's quite hilarious.
Yeah, it's those quick cuts when they're trying to insert everything in there, and you know, you're you know, if you're not fast enough, you know, you're gonna miss it. But yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And they're always cuts. There always used to be those different types of things going on with those fight scenes that the 60s and the 70s shows were always known to have, which was kind of interesting, you know, especially with Buck going up against Tiger Man, who incidentally, in if anybody remembers, in the first movie, in the pilot, Tiger Man changes right from like in the middle of the episode until the end of the episode. Which I always thought was kind of interesting.
This like shorter, fatter version of Tiger Man.
Yeah, exactly. So as we wind things down, I just want to say we will be back on next Friday at 7 p.m. I will be announcing the episode that we'll be covering on Tuesday night, and that will be announced at, the episode or the series that we'll be talking about at 9 p.m. on Tuesday. Also, I want to give a shout out to our local theater group, which is Countrygate, which is in Belvedere, New Jersey. Countrygate unfortunately, like a lot of the theaters that around the country, with everything going on with COVID-19, has had to close down, in the sense that they're not having performances that are being done to the public at the actual theater. But stay tuned, watch their website, which is www.countrygate.org. And they will be doing stuff coming up in the future. So definitely check it out. There's a lot of virtual online theater going on, so you can actually watch things of that nature online. So definitely, keep an eye out for that. It's a special theater that I've been a part of for many years, and I just want to give a shout out to them. And also, I just want to thank our first responders and the people that are keeping us afloat. Everything with COVID-19 going on, there's other stuff in the in the country going on right now, and it's a really tough time for everybody. So I just want to say, everybody, please just stay safe, be aware of your surroundings, social distance, and just be aware, and just keep on top of things. Rob, I want to thank you for joining me, and I appreciate that you wanted to be on the show as my guest co-host, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And I appreciate everybody that tunes in, on Fridays and Sundays when we're on. I really do. This started out as, it's just a labor of love, because love talking about shows that, we grew up with, and shows that of the past. And it's just great to be able to interact with, friends out there, people that I've gotten to know through this, and also just, family and friends that I have. So it's just a way to bring us all together during these times, and definitely going to keep going with this. And it's, been very enjoyable, and it's really fun. One last announcement I want to make, and just remind everybody, Nick Tate is going to be coming back. He will be back on Sunday, June 14th. He will be back. We will have him on at a special time. Usually we are on at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Nick will be joining us at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And that is so that our European friends that have been tuning in can, tune in to watch him live, a little earlier. And then also, Nick is 3 hours behind us as well too. So, just keep that in mind, and that will be in 2 weeks. I will be sending out reminders in regards to that. Also, I'm in the process of having previous episodes on YouTube. So just so you know, I will have more information coming up with that. And also, the show is going to be broadcasting in the next couple weeks from its own page. So I will keep you posted on that. You may see a name change out there, folks. I've had actually some comments made about possibly changing the name, and I have something in the works. So just so you know, it might be a little more catchy, and I will be announcing that, but I don't want to announce it quite yet. But it's going to be coming in the future. But I, again, want to say thank you to everybody. Really appreciate it. And just stay safe. And we'll see you next time. All right. And as I always like to sign off, live long and prosper.
Take care.
Take care, everyone. Good night.